Welcome back to Neural Battlefields, where we explore the conflicts, controversies, and untold stories that shaped our world. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most tragic yet systematically silenced chapters of human history. A story of mass extermination, forced marches through deserts, and a century-long battle over the simple recognition of truth. This is the story of the Armenian Genocide. Before we begin, I want to be clear about something. This video isn't about attacking any nation, religion, or people. It's about remembering. It's about understanding how innocent civilians became victims of political decisions they had no part in making. And it's about asking a question that still echoes today. Why does the world struggle to acknowledge certain truths? If you're ready to confront uncomfortable history and understand why this matters even now, over a century later, then let's begin. And if you find value in these deep dives into history's darkest corners, consider subscribing to Neural Battlefields. Hit that like button and share this with anyone who believes in the power of historical truth. It's April 24, 1915. Constantinople, the heart of the Ottoman Empire, now modern-day Istanbul. In the dead of night, Ottoman authorities begin rounding up Armenian intellectuals, writers, doctors, lawyers, and community leaders. Over 250 prominent Armenians are arrested in a single night. Within weeks, this number swells to thousands. These aren't criminals. These aren't enemy combatants. They're poets, physicians, and professors. Their crime, being Armenian. Most of these men would never return home. They were executed, tortured, or simply disappeared into the darkness of history. This night would become known as Red Sunday, and it marked the beginning of what many historians consider the first genocide of the 20th century. But to understand how we got here, we need to rewind the clock and understand the world that allowed this catastrophe to unfold. The Ottoman Empire in the early 1900s was a dying giant. Once stretching across 3 continents, controlling vast territories from southeastern Europe to the Middle East and North Africa, the empire was now crumbling. Nationalist movements were tearing away at its edges. Wars had stripped away territories. The empire that had once struck fear into the hearts of European powers was now mockingly called the sick man of Europe. The empire's decline was dramatic and painful. In the 19th century alone, it lost Greece to independence in 1829, saw Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gain autonomy after the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, and watched helplessly as European powers carved away pieces of its territory. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were particularly devastating, with the empire losing almost all its European territories. This context of loss, humiliation, and desperate nationalism would prove crucial to understanding what came next. Within this declining empire lived approximately 2 million Armenians. They had been there for centuries, long before the Ottoman conquest. The Armenian presence in Anatolia dated back over 3,000 years. They had their own language, their own alphabet created in 405 AD, and their own branch of Christianity, the Armenian Apostolic Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world. Armenia had been the first nation to officially adopt Christianity as a state religion in 301 AD, even before the Roman Empire. Armenians were Christians in a predominantly Muslim empire, and while they had historically existed under the Ottoman millet system, which allowed religious minorities certain autonomies, their position was always precarious. They were dhimmis, protected but second-class subjects who paid extra taxes and faced legal restrictions. Armenian testimony wasn't equal to Muslim testimony in court. They couldn't carry weapons. They had to pay the jizya, a tax on non-Muslims. Despite these restrictions, many Armenians achieved success as merchants, craftsmen, and professionals, earning them the nickname the Loyal Millet for their general cooperation with Ottoman rule. But this economic success would later become a source of resentment. By the late 1800s, tensions were rising. Armenian communities, influenced by nationalist movements sweeping through Europe, and seeing other Christian minorities gain independence, began advocating for reforms and equal rights. The Ottoman authorities saw this as a threat to the empire's unity. Between 1894 and 1896, Sultan Abdul Hamid II ordered what became known as the Hamidian massacres. Between 100,000 and 300,000 Armenians were killed in these pogroms. It was a horrifying preview of what was to come. Then came the Young Turks. In 1908, a group of reformist officers calling themselves the Committee of Union and Progress staged a revolution, promising to modernize the Ottoman Empire and establish constitutional rule. Many Armenians initially welcomed this change, hoping it would bring equality and protection. But history had other plans. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, siding with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. This decision would prove catastrophic for the Armenian population. The Ottomans launched a disastrous military campaign against Russia in the Caucasus. When it failed miserably, with Ottoman forces suffering devastating losses in the freezing mountains, someone had to be blamed. The Young Turk leadership, now dominated by the triumvirate of Mame Talat Pasha, Ismail Enver Pasha, and Ahmed Cemal Pasha, pointed their fingers at the Armenians. They claimed, without substantial evidence, that Armenians were collaborating with Russia, acting as a fifth column within the empire. Never mind that thousands of Armenians were actually serving loyally in the Ottoman army. The narrative was set. Armenians were now branded as traitors, and traitors deserved no mercy. What happened next was systematic, organized, and horrifyingly efficient. After the arrest of Armenian intellectuals on April 24, the genocide unfolded in stages, each more brutal than the last. First came the Armenian soldiers. Those serving in the Ottoman military were disarmed, formed into labor battalions, and then systematically executed. Imagine being a soldier fighting for your country, only to be marched into the wilderness and shot by your own commanders because of your ethnicity. Then the real horror began. Village by village, town by town, Ottoman authorities issued deportation orders. Armenian families were given hours, sometimes just minutes, to pack whatever they could carry. They were told they were being relocated for their own safety, moved away from the war zones. It was a lie. What awaited them was death in multiple forms. The process was methodical and calculated. Gendarmes, Ottoman police forces, would arrive in a town and post notices. All Armenians were to prepare for deportation. Families scrambled to sell possessions for whatever they could get, often for a fraction of their value. Turkish and Kurdish neighbors sometimes bought homes and businesses for pennies, knowing the Armenians would never return. Some neighbors tried to help, hiding Armenian children or offering what assistance they could. But these were the exceptions. Most either participated in the looting or looked away. The deportation caravans became death marches. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians, mostly women, children, and elderly, since the men had already been killed, were forced to walk hundreds of miles through the Syrian Desert toward concentration camps. They walked without adequate food, without water, under the scorching sun. Ottoman soldiers and bands of armed irregulars called the Special Organization, essentially death squads composed of released criminals and Kurdish tribes, attacked the convoys repeatedly. Witnesses described scenes from hell. Aurora Mardiganian, a survivor who was just 14 when the genocide began, later testified that she saw girls crucified, their bodies left hanging as warnings. Leslie Davis, American consul in Harput, documented finding thousands of corpses in the valleys around Lake Hovhannes. He wrote that the stench was unbearable, that bodies were piled so thick that they dammed the streams. Women and girls were raped, kidnapped, and sold into slavery. Children were abducted, forcibly converted to Islam, and given to Turkish families. The elderly and weak who couldn't keep pace were simply shot or left to die on the roadside. There are accounts of mothers throwing their babies into rivers rather than watch them die slowly of starvation. Others chose to jump off cliffs with their children rather than face what awaited them. Those who survived the marches arrived at concentration camps in the Syrian Desert, places like Deir ez-Zor. But arrival didn't mean survival. Thousands died of starvation, disease, and exposure in these camps. Many were driven into the desert and abandoned. Some were burned alive in caves. Others were drowned in rivers. The methods of killing were varied and cruel. Mass burnings, drowning, crucifixion, people thrown from cliffs, infants smashed against rocks in front of their mothers, pregnant women bayoneted. The cruelty wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. The goal wasn't just to kill Armenians. It was to erase them, to terrorize survivors into silence, to make the very existence of Armenians in their ancestral homeland impossible. And here's what makes this even more tragic. The world knew. Foreign diplomats stationed in the Ottoman Empire sent detailed reports to their governments. American missionaries working in the region documented the atrocities. Journalists wrote about it. The New York Times published dozens of articles about the massacre of Armenians in 1915 alone. The evidence was overwhelming and contemporary. Henry Morgenthau, the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, sent desperate cables to Washington describing what he called a campaign of race extermination. He wrote, "When the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race." In his memoirs, published in 1918, he detailed his conversations with Talat Pasha, who told him bluntly that the Armenians had to go. When Morgenthau objected, Talat reportedly said, "Why are you so interested in the Armenians anyway? You are a Jew. These people are Christians. Why should you be interested in them?" Johannes Lepsius, a German Protestant missionary and theologian, compiled a 440-page report documenting the genocide based on eyewitness accounts and official documents. Armin Wegner, a German medic stationed in the Ottoman Empire, secretly took hundreds of photographs documenting the deportations and massacres, smuggling them out at great personal risk. These photographs would later become crucial evidence. Allied powers issued a joint declaration in May 1915, explicitly using the language of crimes against humanity and civilization. This was actually the first time the phrase crimes against humanity was used in international diplomacy. Russia, France, and Britain jointly warned that they would hold the Ottoman government and its agents personally responsible for these crimes. Newspaper reports were vivid and disturbing. On September 28, 1915, the New York Times headline read, "800,000 Armenians counted destroyed." Another article described how women and children were stripped naked and beaten to death. The American public read these accounts. Relief organizations raised money to help survivors, but knowledge didn't translate into action. But knowing and acting are different things. The world was consumed by World War I. Hundreds of thousands were dying on European battlefields. The suffering of Armenians, however massive, was treated as a secondary concern, a regrettable but distant tragedy. Some aid reached the survivors, primarily through American relief organizations, but no military intervention came. No government took concrete action to stop the genocide as it was happening. By the time the killing largely ceased in 1923, the toll was staggering. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that approximately 1.5 million Armenians died during the genocide. Some estimates go as low as 800,000, others as high as 1.8 million. Regardless of the exact number, the result was clear. The Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire was decimated. Ancient Armenian communities that had existed for thousands of years were erased overnight. Churches were destroyed. Cultural treasures were lost. A civilization was nearly wiped from its ancestral homeland. The few who survived were scattered across the globe, forming diaspora communities in Lebanon, Syria, France, America, and dozens of other countries. They carried with them memories of horror and a burning determination that their story would not be forgotten. You might think that after such a clear-cut case of mass murder, recognition would be automatic. But here's where the story takes another dark turn. In the aftermath of World War I, there were actually attempts at justice. The Ottoman government that succeeded the Young Turks arrested some of the perpetrators. Courts-martial were held. Some officials were convicted and sentenced to death, though most sentences were never carried out. Mehmed Talat, one of the main architects of the genocide, fled to Germany. In 1921, he was assassinated in Berlin by Soghaman Taylirian, an Armenian genocide survivor whose entire family had been killed. Taylirian's trial became international news. His defense argued temporary insanity caused by the trauma of witnessing genocide. The German court acquitted him, effectively acknowledging the reality of the Armenian genocide. But as Turkey emerged from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, a new nationalist narrative took hold. The new Turkish Republic sought to distance itself from Ottoman-era atrocities while simultaneously denying they had occurred. The official Turkish position, which persists to this day, is that while Armenians died during World War I, it was the result of war, not genocide. They claim the deaths were part of the broader casualties of the war, and that Turkish Muslims also died in similar numbers. This denial isn't passive. It's active, systematic, and state-sponsored. Turkey has spent billions of dollars over decades funding academic chairs, lobbying governments, and promoting revisionist histories. They pressure allies, threaten to cut diplomatic ties with countries that recognize the genocide, and prosecute Turkish citizens who publicly acknowledge it under laws that criminalize insulting Turkishness. The denial rests on several arguments that historians have repeatedly debunked. Turkey claims there was no systematic plan to exterminate Armenians, just wartime relocations. But the documentary evidence, including telegrams from Turkish officials explicitly ordering killings, contradicts this. They claim death tolls are exaggerated. But multiple independent sources, from missionaries to diplomats to German military officers allied with the Ottomans, all reported massive death tolls. They claim Armenians were a security threat. But killing children, elderly civilians, and people in regions nowhere near the front lines cannot be justified as security measures. The impact of this denial is profound. It's not just about history. Denial of genocide is the final stage of genocide itself, as genocide scholar Gregory Stanton noted. By denying the genocide, Turkey denies justice to survivors and their descendants. It denies the historical truth, and it creates a template for future atrocities by showing that mass murder can be committed and then simply denied. Raphael Lemkin, the lawyer who literally invented the word genocide in 1944, was directly inspired by the Armenian case. He asked, "Why is the killing of a million a lesser crime than the killing of an individual?" The Holocaust amplified global awareness of genocide, and many Holocaust scholars have noted the parallels with the Armenian case. Hitler himself, when planning the invasion of Poland, reportedly said, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" His point was chilling. Mass murder could be committed and forgotten. So where do we stand today, over a century later? The recognition of the Armenian genocide has become a political football. As of now, 33 countries officially recognize it as genocide. The list includes France, Russia, Canada, Italy, Germany, Brazil, Argentina, and many others. The European Parliament recognized it. Pope Francis called it genocide. In the United States, the journey to recognition was long and frustrating. Due to Turkey's strategic importance as a NATO ally and its control of key military bases, successive American administrations avoided the term. But on April 24, 2021, President Joe Biden became the first sitting U.S. president to officially recognize the Armenian genocide, calling it exactly what it was: genocide. However, many countries still refuse recognition, either from political considerations or under Turkish pressure. Israel, despite its own history with genocide, has been reluctant to fully recognize it, though this is gradually changing. The United Kingdom recognizes it in Parliament but not officially by the government. Australia's federal government doesn't recognize it, though several states do. For the Armenian diaspora scattered across the world, April 24 remains a day of remembrance. In Yerevan, Armenia's capital, hundreds of thousands walk to the Tsitsernakaberd Memorial every year, laying flowers at the eternal flame that honors the dead. The Armenian saying is Meds Yeghern, the great crime. They don't forget. They won't forget. The survivors who lived through the genocide and made it to old age have nearly all passed now, but their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren carry the memories. They share the stories of great-grandmothers who watched their children die, of great-grandfathers who were the sole survivors of their villages. These aren't abstract historical events for them. They're family history, written in blood. And this brings us to the question at the heart of this documentary. Why does this matter now? Why, over a century later, should we care about recognition of the Armenian genocide? First, because truth matters. History isn't just a collection of facts and dates. It's the story of who we are, how we got here, and what we're capable of, both noble and horrific. When we allow lies about history to stand unchallenged, we corrupt our understanding of reality itself. The Armenians who died deserve to have their suffering acknowledged, not erased or minimized. Second, because justice matters. The descendants of genocide survivors live with intergenerational trauma. Properties were stolen, treasures were lost, and families were destroyed. While material compensation can never restore what was taken, acknowledgement is itself a form of justice. It says, "What happened to you was wrong. You weren't forgotten. Your pain was real." Third, because precedent matters. The denial of the Armenian genocide set a template for future genocides. From the Holocaust to Rwanda to Bosnia to Darfur, the pattern repeats: dehumanization, systematic killing, and then denial. Each time genocide is successfully denied, it becomes easier for the next perpetrator to believe they can get away with it. Fourth, because reconciliation matters. Modern Turkey is not the Ottoman Empire. Turkish citizens today didn't commit these crimes. But as long as the Turkish state maintains an official policy of denial, true reconciliation between Turks and Armenians is impossible. Many Turkish intellectuals, academics, and activists have courageously called for Turkey to acknowledge its history. They understand that facing difficult truths isn't weakness, it's strength. Germany's acknowledgement of the Holocaust didn't destroy Germany. It helped create a better, more honest Germany. The Armenian genocide is also a reminder about the fragility of civilization. The Armenians of the Ottoman Empire weren't some isolated tribe. They were doctors, merchants, artists, and craftsmen. They had built churches and schools and businesses. They had lived in these lands for thousands of years, and in just a few years, an entire civilization was nearly erased. It shows how quickly normal can become nightmare. In 1914, most Ottoman Armenians were going about their lives, working, raising families, and worrying about ordinary things. By 1916, most were dead. The transition from normalcy to genocide happened shockingly fast. It's a warning that we can never take peace and stability for granted. It also reveals the power and the limits of international awareness. The Armenian genocide wasn't hidden. It was reported in real time. And yet, it wasn't stopped. This raises uncomfortable questions about international responsibility and the concept of never again that would later emerge after the Holocaust. What does never again mean when genocides keep happening? For content creators, historians, educators, and anyone who cares about truth, the Armenian genocide is a test case. How do we talk about difficult history? How do we acknowledge suffering without creating new hatreds? How do we hold institutions accountable while recognizing that people today aren't responsible for the crimes of their ancestors? The answer isn't to attack modern Turkey or Turkish people. The answer is to separate the Ottoman state's actions from the Turkish nation today, to acknowledge that historical truth and modern identity can coexist, and to recognize that remembering victims doesn't mean creating new enemies. Some argue that focusing on historical grievances prevents us from moving forward, but the opposite is true. We can't genuinely move forward without acknowledging what happened. Imagine if Germany still denied the Holocaust. How could Europe have rebuilt? How could Israel have relations with Germany? Acknowledgement isn't about dwelling on the past. It's about creating an honest foundation for the future. The story of the Armenian Genocide is also a story about the power of memory and the persistence of truth. Despite a century of denial, despite the massive resources deployed to obfuscate and confuse, the truth has survived. It survived because survivors told their stories to their children. It survived because historians did their work. It survived because journalists kept writing. It survived because activists kept demanding recognition. In an age of information warfare, deepfakes, and contested realities, the Armenian Genocide reminds us that objective truth exists and that it eventually emerges, even if it takes a century. The documents are there. The photographs are there. The testimonies are there. No amount of denial can erase them. As we close this documentary, I want to leave you with a thought. The Armenian Genocide isn't just Armenian history. It's human history. It's a chapter in the ongoing story of what human beings are capable of doing to each other when dehumanization takes root, when nationalism becomes toxic, and when the world chooses to look away. But it's also a story about resilience. The Armenian people survived. They rebuilt. The diaspora flourished. Armenia exists today as an independent nation. The culture that was targeted for elimination still thrives. In that sense, the genocide failed in its ultimate objective. You cannot kill a people's spirit. You cannot erase them from history. Every April 24, when Armenians around the world light candles and visit memorials, when they say Meds Yeghern and remember the dead, they're performing an act of resistance against erasure. They're saying, we're still here. You tried to silence us. You failed. This is why we at Neural Battlefields believe in exploring these difficult topics, not to spread hatred, not to divide people, but to ensure that the voices of victims are heard, that truth is preserved, and that we learn from history's darkest chapters so we can build a better future. If this video has taught you something, if it's made you think, or if you believe these stories need to be told, please subscribe to Neural Battlefields. Hit that like button. Share this video with others who care about historical truth. Leave a comment telling us what you learned or what aspect of this history you'd like to know more about. We have a community here that believes in facing difficult truths, in understanding complex histories, and in never forgetting the victims of injustice. Whether you're Armenian, Turkish, or from anywhere else in the world, you're welcome here as long as you come with an open mind and a commitment to truth. The Armenian Genocide happened. 1.5 million people died. Their story deserves to be told, and the world's reluctance to fully acknowledge this truth is itself a story worth examining. Thank you for watching Neural Battlefields. Remember, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. Let's make sure we never forget. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the battlefields of history with us. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.